Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is October 12th, 2015, and we have a jam-packed show tonight. We're going to be discussing the ongoing situation in the Middle East that could affect the world and every individual listening to this show personally. If things are taken to their bitter end, we're going to talk about a number of other things, try to mention Hillary Clinton, try to mention just some notes from the South Carolina flood, since this is a local issue here, statewide issue here in South Carolina. The world was watching. See if we can mention some of that, and see if we can also comment on the Senator Pan recall. All of that, though, is going to have to take a back seat to the international situation once again, because we need to talk about the potential for world war, which just became more possible in the last 19, 20, 23 hours or so. The show's being recorded on October the 11th, 2015. So by the time you hear this show, the situation could be a lot worse. And, of course, we hope that's not the case, but we'll get into that in a second. Just a brief announcement. I hope you've been going to BrandonTurbeville.com. That's the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all the archives of this show, all of the relevant information there on BrandonTurbeville.com. Of course, there's free books. All the social media is integrated to the website now. Got a lot of other article links and stuff that are up there. So we hope you have been going to visit that. And as I promised, we were moving forward on another update to the website and really to the way the books are getting out there. We are in the process of expanding the reach of the books and expanding the ability and availability of the books, and we're trying to do that in a way that it will be much more convenient and affordable for everyone to pick up these books and to support me in the process. Unfortunately, I've been reminded that the costs of the books are somewhat prohibitive for people to purchase, and that is certainly the case. And unfortunately, sometimes that happens, and we're doing what we can to rectify that, and hopefully in the next few weeks we'll have made some progress. We'll get those books up on the new platform out there on the website, BrandonTurbeville.com, as soon as possible, and then we can move on to expanding some other things on the website. And then, of course, we have the new initiative that has not yet been announced, but that will require, if you want to participate, if we want to try to stop what we see happening in the world today, whether it's world war, our rights being violated, essentially this whole system, this New World Order system, as a lot of people will call it, if we want to see this stopped, then we need to take advantage of the time that we have, because our window is closing, and I hope to, once we get the situation with the website resolved, the books resolved, and everything integrates, I plan to announce an initiative that I'd like each and every one of you to be a part of, and it will involve you being a leader in your area, and it will involve some work. So if you want to be involved, you can do it this way, and I will announce that sooner rather than later, and I'll go into detail when it's time. Now, the news, and I should mention that if you want to catch my work on the websites as it's posted, you can always go to Activist Post, naturalblaze.com. You can also go to the antimedia.org. But if you want to follow my work, just go to BrandonTurbeville.com. That's what I recommend. That's the home page. That's the center of operations for my work. Now, Truth on the Tracks every Monday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here at UCY.TV. We've got to talk about this situation that just occurred in Syria and Turkey. We have a report that a Russian jet was shot down by Turkish forces after it allegedly entered Turkish airspace. Now, according to a number of websites, some of them completely incredible, but some of them credible, like the International Business Times credible enough, we have a report that a Russian Air Force jet was shot down by Turkish forces after it, quote-unquote, strayed into the country's airspace, according to unconfirmed reports. So again, these reports have not been confirmed. They have not been confirmed by the embassies of Turkey or Russia, the consulates, but they're out there. And this could be one of two things, right? The idea is that it was a Turkish-based journalist who tweeted out that 3 Turkish planes were responding after their radar locked on to some mysterious MiG-29 jets. Of course, MiG-29s are the models that Russian forces use. They apparently scrambled those jets, and then there were people in Huratan, that's northern Syria, reporting that they saw a large explosion as the 3 fighter jets were flying overhead. Now, Turkish officials in the past have warned that they've actually warned Russia that they would be held responsible for any undesired incident that might occur in the future. Now, keep in mind, this doesn't mean that Russia was violating Turkey's airspace, because Turkey maintains a de facto buffer zone in the northern part of Syria. It goes about 5 miles, I believe, into Syria. They just declared this unilaterally some time ago. So they declare that anybody 5 miles, within that 5 mile area from the border of Turkey, 5 miles deep into Syria, that's Turkish airspace, according to Turkey. Well, there's one problem with that, is it's not Turkey's airspace. It's Syria's airspace. You don't get to declare other countries' airspace your airspace. So they're acting unilaterally in that sense. So if a Russian jet was shot down over that 5 mile buffer zone, then that is a unilateral attack on Russia, and it deserves reciprocity. But if the Russian jet was over Turkish territory, there's more leeway to Turkey, regardless of what this is. And let's talk about quickly what this could be. One of the things this could be is it could be true. It could be true that Russia was flying a jet into Turkish territory and got shot down. It could be true that Russia was flying in Syria in that 5 mile zone and Turkey came in and shot it down. Or it could also be true that it just simply didn't happen, and that Turkey knows, all right, if it didn't happen, they can claim that they shot down 2-3 Russian jets, and there won't be any retaliation because the incident never happened. And the reports going into the Russian embassy will obviously be that it didn't happen, and so there's no danger of collision. Then it will simply be a propaganda effort with the Russians denying and the Turkish government saying that they did it, and as a sense to make Russia look weak, as if we can attack Russia, but they won't do anything in return. That could also be what it is. Now, if this situation is real, though, if a Russian jet was shot down, there's a couple of things we got to point out. Again, that buffer zone, that's illegal. The Turks don't have any right to that. So that's irrelevant. If they shot it down, that's an aggressive attack. If it was flying over the Turkish border in Turkish territory, well, we gotta look at that. Is that a violation of Turkish sovereignty? Well, yeah, but the Turks don't seem to have a problem violating national sovereignty on their own, right? When they say, "Oh, look, there's ISIS terrorist here," or there's more likely Kurdish fighters in Syria that pose a danger to Turkey, they don't have a problem flying over the Turkey-Syria border and bombing the hell out of Syria, do they? But I guess, according to them, what's good for the goose is not good for the gander, because when Russia is bombing ISIS targets in Syria, actually bombing ISIS targets in Syria, if they chase those bearded savages across the border from where they come, that's considered a violation of national sovereignty. And of course, the biggest home right now, or the biggest way station for ISIS terrorists, is Turkey. It's the main way station. So all of this boils down to one thing. If the incident didn't happen, and we really hope that all this is a propaganda attack at Russia to make Russia look weak, that this was actually a made-up incident to make Russia look weak in the face of the drastic bombing of the ISIS terrorists in Syria, where it's actually having an effect, proving that NATO strategy has been nothing but protecting ISIS this whole time. But that's what we hope it is. But if it's not, what we see is a dramatic and dangerous, extremely dangerous situation for the world. What we have witnessed, if this attack did take place, was a NATO attack on Russia. And that is extremely dangerous. How is Russia going to respond if this is real? Are they going to allow an attack on their jets with no retaliation? Are they going to retaliate in some way? And if they do retaliate some way, remember, an attack on one NATO member is an attack on them all. So how is this going to play out? We simply don't know. We hope, of course, again, that this incident never happened, that it's simply propaganda, and that's very possible. But if it did happen, and if the events are taking place as if these unconfirmed reports by the International Business Times are accurate, then we are entering a very dangerous situation here. And I think people should both get active immediately in the political realm, but also start to make preparations for situations that may get beyond our control. So please bear in mind, to keep watching this, and this can go either way. But this is something, again, we need to get active. We need to be active in the political sphere, but we also have to be somewhat cognizant of things that can get out of control. So we will be watching that closely. Now, I want to, if I can, return to what I talked about last week in terms of the Uyghur terrorists. We went through a lot of what was behind the Uyghur terrorist networks, the Grey Wolves, and so forth. I just want to finish up on that, I guess, if I can. I want people to understand what this stuff is, because it was in the news last week, and unfortunately we didn't get to really go into deep detail about it. We saw a number of the discussions about Uyghur terrorism in the mainstream media, and even in the alternative media, except for a few. Tony Carlucci's was very thorough, and maybe a couple of others, and of course my article was thorough as well. There are discussions regarding the Uyghur terrorist issue have been largely superfluous and tangential. It's not really attributing the importance of the connections between the Syrian crisis and the separatist movement in Xinjiang in China. It seems like to most people that they see that the crisis in Syria and the one in China is unrelated, but they're actually related to some degree. We mentioned also about this issue of Jisr al-Shukur. It's a town in Idlib province in Syria, and it's about 12 miles away from the border with Turkey, and that had been the scene of at least 2 massacres by the Western-backed bearded lunatics, the bearded monkeys funded and supported by the United States. The moderate rebels, the moderate cannibals. So we had one massacre in 2011 and another massacre in 2015. And in this second massacre, the most recent one, the 2015 one, most of the killers were Chechen. And after the massacre of the indigenous Syrians took place, we had hundreds of Uyghur families moved in to resettle the town. Afra Dagher, who is a Syrian living in Syria, she's a friend of mine, and we've done a number of interviews on my show. We've done videos together. The regular listeners will know who she is. She wrote an article about this that was published on her website. I posted it at BrandonTurbeville.com. It was posted in other places. And this is what she said. She said, now, there are new residents, or should I say settlers. They are known as Uyghurs. These Uyghurs, like the Chechens and other terrorists, are fighting together with other moderate rebels and under the name of ISIS. Yet these terrorists are now bringing their families with them. This movement of terrorists has now brought 3,500 Uyghur families to live in Idlib countryside after displacing the original Syrian residents. This new ethnic cleansing program is sponsored by Turkish intelligence in coordination with al-Nusra, ISIS, and other rebel factions. This plan to transfer terrorists from China, Uyghurs, Turkey, Turkestan Party, to areas in Syria such as Idlib, Raqqa, and Deir el-Sur in Syria has been taking place for 2 years. There are now 20,000 terrorists from the Turkestan Party, and the Turks are training them in order to send them to Syria. Their ideology tells them that Syria is their real homeland, not Turkey or China, even as they massacre the citizens or civilians living there. These same types of terrorists have been used before in Afghanistan. So where is this going? This plan is an attempt to destabilize, balkanize, and forever change the demography and identity of the region. All right, end quote. So part of the goal, yes, is to destroy the ethnic and demographic nature of Syria as it existed before the war. It's also designed to destroy modern, secular Syrian culture. But the fact that the Uyghur terrorists are both involved in the fighting as well as the resettling areas of Syria, that goes to show that the connection between terrorism, the destruction of Syria, Uyghurs, Western NATO intelligence, all of that is much deeper. So the reality is that the expansive network of Uyghur terror organizations are by no means merely organic and spontaneous. They're a product of the same Western NATO and specifically Turkish intelligence networks that have created and directed Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, ISIS, etc. So the groups, the power behind the Uyghur terror networks, the most obvious culprit behind the Uyghur separatist movement in Xinjiang is for no other reason than, its past history and current involvement in destabilizations all across the world, the United States. After all, the United States has been, it has a vested interest, geopolitical interest in the destabilization of China. It's been involved with a number of other color revolutions and separatist movements in the past in China, including the Umbrella Revolution, the Tibet separatist movement with the Dalai Lama. Just that is enough evidence to point the finger at the United States. The destabilization in Xinjiang is another Western-backed movement that is designed to keep the Chinese under control. So we have this World Uyghur Conference. It's an international organization of, quote, exiled Uyghur groups, end quote, that allegedly represents the collective will of the Uyghur people, right? It's really nothing more than a Western NATO front group. The World Uyghur Congress is directly funded by the U.S. State Department through the National Endowment for Democracy. The National Endowment for Democracy provides the World Uyghur Conference with over with over $250,000 every year. In fact, the NED is responsible for organizing the World Uyghur Congress events. They pay for most of the cost of doing so. Their annual meetings involve a number of Uyghur groups, that come together with a host of Western officials and businessmen and influence peddlers who really just they go there, they attend, and they reaffirm their solidarity with the World Uyghur Congress and the Uyghur cause. The World Uyghur Congress really, it says its position is one of nonviolent opposition to what it calls Chinese occupation. And this is what it says on its own website. The World Uyghur Congress declares a nonviolent and peaceful opposition movement against Chinese occupation of East Turkestan and an unconditional adherence to the international accepted human rights standard as laid down in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and adherence to the principles of democratic pluralism and rejection of totalitarianism, religious intolerance, and terrorism as an instrument of policy, end quote. Well, it all sounds very good, doesn't it? But it claims to oppose the use of violence, but the World Uyghur Congress regularly justifies violence, or at least it refuses to condemn it. In 2014, there was a brutal murder of a prominent Uyghur imam. He was a 74-year-old guy. His name Jume Tahir, in front of China's biggest and oldest mosque. And the World Uyghur Congress actually came out and denounced him as a tool of the Chinese government, and even went so far as to denounce China for sentencing his killers, who were Uyghur terrorists, to the death penalty. The Uyghur Congress clearly just not only finds it impossible to denounce terrorism, it serves as a rhetorical cover for it. Now, that brings us to the question of Turkey, the Turkish connection And we went into some of this last week as well, but I want to go back over it so we have a context for what I want to do in terms of finishing up. The fact that the United States is heavily involved in the promotion of Uyghur terrorism. It's not widely known in the general public, but it is rather widely known amongst geopolitical analysts. But even with geopolitical analysts, it's rarely discussed the connection between Uyghur terrorism and Turkey. Now, the history of the Uyghur people, and it's shrouded in terms of historical research, is very shadowy, but it does trace itself back to Turkish ancestors. So we do have a connection between Turkey and Chinese Uyghurs that Turkish intelligence is able to exploit in order to create and maintain and direct Uyghur terrorist organizations based on that ancestral history. We have Operation Gladio. Also, we should mention, it was for those of you who don't know, that was a NATO plan that was allegedly drafted in order to deal a potential blow to a Soviet invasion of Europe. So the plan was during the Cold War, if the Soviets ever invaded Europe, they wanted to create a network of terrorist stay-behind networks, in other words, guerrilla-style resistance to Soviet invasion and occupation. But the guise of creating these networks revolved around the potential Russian invasion. The reality of the situation was these networks were turned against the domestic populations of the host European nations. They were used as false flag terror organizations. They were operations used to silence and intimidate and kill political rivals. That's what they were. And Turkey was no exception to this rule. They got its own Gladio networks, and their network was known as the Grey Wolves. And, of course, it was with the aid, supervision, and direction of NATO. We've got a couple of good mainstream media articles, surprisingly, that mention the Grey Wolves. There was one written by Martin A. Lee of the Los Angeles Times called Turkish Dirty War Revealed, but Papal Shootings Still Obscured, that was published in 1998. Let me just read from that briefly. Quote, for 20 years, Turkish security agencies sponsored an ultra-right-wing death squads and narco-criminal gangs that were involved in bombings, kidnappings, and other terrorist attacks. Described in a leaked 120-page parliamentary report, this sordid sub-rosa alliance waged a dirty war against Kurds and Turkish dissidents. Confirming what human rights activists long suspected, the report concluded that security forces were responsible for many of Turkey's 14,000 unsolved murders and disappearances in recent years. 14,000. In late 1970s, armed bands of Grey Wolves launched a wave of bomb attacks and shootings that killed hundreds of people, including public officials, journalists, students, lawyers, labor organizers, left-wing activists, and ethnic Kurds. During this period, the Grey Wolves operated with encouragement and protection of the counter-guerrilla organization, a section of the Turkish Army Special Warfare Department. Working out of the U.S. military aid mission building in Ankara, the Special Warfare Department received funds and training from U.S. advisors to establish stay-behind squads of civilian irregulars who were set up to engage in acts of sabotage and resistance in the event of a Soviet invasion. Similar Cold War counter-guerrilla units were created in every member state of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But instead of preparing for foreign enemies, these operatives often set their sights on domestic targets. End quote. There's another article in the Los Angeles Times around about the same time called Turkey's Grey Wolves Nip at Heels of Power. It's just two paragraphs. Quote, at the height of the Cold War, the Army used the Grey Wolves as a violent counterweight to Turkish communists. The party's coffers swelled with secret contributions from the government. By the late 1970s, the Grey Wolves had spun out of state control. Their paramilitary wing fought a campaign against leftist rivals that killed nearly 6,000 people. Ali Agca, who shot Pope John Paul II in a 1981 assassination attempt, is alleged to have been affiliated with the party. End quote. So don't believe that they spun out of state control, but that's an interesting connection. I want to point that out, how it came from the mainstream, actually. Now, despite the fact that the Grey Wolves have really inspired terror in the hearts of many Turks, it's interesting that the Grey Wolves organization has a potent effect on Turkish politics today. It actually functions as the the paramilitary wing of the Nationalist Movement Party, the MHP, and that is a party that currently holds the third largest number of seats in the Turkish parliament. Grey Wolves are ultra-nationalist. They're described by some people as neo-Nazi. Now, I think in our society today, we have come up with a situation in which the term neo-Nazi, racist, homophobic, sexist, they have no similarity to the original meaning of those words. So those terms get thrown out way too easily. And neo-Nazi, I don't know. I don't know if I can say that they're neo-Nazi, but the Grey Wolves are, without a doubt, ultra-nationalists. And nationalism, for the record, does have some positive qualities. It does, and that might offend some of the more PC-obsessed individuals, but nationalism does have some good qualities. These guys are ultra-nationalists, though, so this is not the same thing as simple nationalism. I'm not going to get into that, but I only say that to point out that some people describe them as neo-Nazi. We're just going to call them ultra-nationalists to avoid falling into the PC trap of calling everything that we don't agree with specific trendy terms. The organization, the Grey Wolves, really branched out further than the simple nationalist cover also. So basically, the Tony Carlucci said it best. He said NATO's stay-behind networks have become NATO's go-abroad networks. So, yeah, exactly. They essentially go out and they project the same sort of violence and terrorism and political coercion abroad after the Cold War that they did at home during the Cold War. Turkey has maintained these operations in Turkey, but it also extended them to China's Xinjiang province, among a few other locations in Eurasia. The Grey Wolves have this pan-Asian movement. It represents a cooperative effort with the rest of NATO intelligence, basically to subjugate all other potential rivals, China, Russia, etc., as well as this feeble and futile attempt on the part of the Turkish elite to reestablish the Ottoman Empire. This is what's funny, is because you have these different levels of layers of agendas here. You have the world oligarchical agenda that is essentially playing everyone off as these chess pieces, and then you have the NATO versus the Russian oligarchy, and then essentially what's happening there is that you have a jockeying for geopolitical power. Hegemony, particularly on the side of the NATO power, is what is being desired. The lower level, when you get down on the international nations, not international nations, but when you get down on individual nations, you have oligarchical agendas at the national level, and you have that with Turkey. And with Turkey, it seems to be this idea of promoting a situation in which you would have the new Ottoman Empire with Erdogan as the Ataturk. And sorry, Erdogan is a nitwit. He's already sealed his fate. He may provide provide Turkey as a useful tool to NATO for a while, but sorry, Erdogan, you will never get the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Grey Wolves, the use of the Grey Wolves as an international NATO-oriented terror organization for destabilization purposes, it acts as the unofficial military wing of the Uyghur-centric terror apparatus, while the World Uyghur Congress represents the political wing. So, what I didn't get to go through last week is what's coming up now. I want to talk about where Uyghur terror is being used, and then we've got to move on. Now, as I've been talking about, the use of Uyghur terror organizations has largely been confined to Xinjiang province and China. That's the center of Uyghur destabilization. Over the course of the Syrian crisis, as we've had jihadist forces organized by NATO, the GCC, Israel, Turkey, they've been flooding into Syria from locations all across the world. The Uyghur contingent, of course, was not far behind. We had numerous reports of Uyghur terrorists operating in Syria beginning early on. We had subsequent confirmation of that with photographs, with witness testimony, video corroboration. Now, Syria is a victim to Uyghur terrorist groups like the Turkestan Islamic Party, that's TIP. The TIP has posted pictures of what they call little jihadists. These are small children being trained in al-Qaeda training camps based in, moderate rebel-held territory in Idlib. The TIP maintains at least 2 training camps in Syria. One of them is for children and one of them is for adults. Again, moderate rebels. The TIP is active in China. It's active in Pakistan. It's active in Afghanistan. And the TIP has been involved in almost all of the major operations that have been taking place in the Idlib province in Syria over the last year or so. The jihadists of the TIP assisted in the capture of Abu Duhur Air Base in the city of Jisr al-Shughur, where it launched at least 2 suicide bombings in support of the operation. Also helped overrun several towns and villages in the strategic Al-Ghab plain with Jund al-Aqsa and 2 Uzbek groups, Katibat al-Tawahid wal-Jihad, which was an Al-Qaeda affiliate, again, moderate rebels, and the Imam Bukhari Jamaat, which pledged allegiance to Mullah Akhtar Mansour of the Taliban. So you see more moderate rebels at work. All right. So all of that information that we've discussed really corroborates what Afra Dagher was reporting, that the Uyghur terrorists were not only being used to fight the Syrian army and wage a war of terror against civilians, but their families were being moved into Idlib, particularly Jisr al-Shughur, in order to colonize the land. And in this regard, Turkey's fingerprints are all over the plan, since Uyghurs have an ancestral link to Turkey, and planning, these quote-unquote Turks in Syria would be a logical extension of not only the NATO plan, but also the Neo-Ottoman plan. So it's like the colonization of a people more in line with the jihadist elements of Turkish society in an area that borders Turkey is a logical progression of both the goal of destabilization of the Syrian government, as well as the erasure of Syrian culture, and the creation of a jihadist caliphate that ultimately would be the new Ottoman Empire. That exemplifies the logic of Turkish oligarchs, as well as the intelligence communities and megalomaniacs like Erdogan. Now, Thailand has also experienced a series of bombings related to the Grey Wolves and the Uyghur terrorist networks. Tony Cartalucci has written extensively about this. In addition to fomenting violence across China, there's been trafficking terrorists from Xinjiang through Southeast Asia and then on to Turkey, where they're used and sent into Syria. And apparently this trafficking network kind of snaked its way through Thailand, and it was exposed when Thailand detained about 100 Uyghurs, which it then deported back to Beijing. And on the same day that Thailand did that, the World Uyghur Congress and NATO's Grey Wolves organized violent protests in Turkey, in Ankara, and at the Thai consulate in Istanbul, and actually invaded and destroyed the Thai consulate. A month after that, we had a devastating bomb that detonated in the heart of Bangkok, killing about 20 Chinese tourists and injuring 100 more. The BBC was already on the site before the blast. They seem to be very good at that. The BBC concluded, even before the bodies were cleared from the site, that the Uyghurs were behind the blast. And this was really done to deflect blame from Thaksin Shinawatra, who had been attempting to regain power in Thailand for years, with the military now in control, and essentially a dictatorship of the military variety, but not a NATO dictatorship. So the Shinawatra and the Uyghur terrorists really are the same Western proxies that are helping to encircle and contain China, kind of building up this wall of proxy states around Beijing, and trying to create chaos in China, so China can never get its house in order and really represent an opposition. But that doesn't seem to be working as well as they'd hoped. That the Umbrella Revolution had failed and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, one of the things that we should point out here is regarding these two Western proxies is the fact that many past bombings associated with Shinawatра's terrorist networks, which are extensive, they match the methods used by Turkish Uyghur terrorists, which really make it likely that NATO's own extraterritorial networks are working together, right? That this is the Uyghur, Turkish, Shinawatra networks are all working together. So there's that. Now, that snake line may traverse China, Southeast Asia, Turkey, and Syria, but there's also ample evidence that that same terror network will be exported to target Russia inside of Russian territory, particularly Crimea, this time using the Tatars in the same method as the Uyghurs are being used in China. So in areas where Russia borders China, it's likely that the Uyghurs are going to be used again against Russia, but in these other areas, it's the Tatars. So on August 1st and August 2nd, there was a meeting at the Hotel Bill Kent in Ankara, and that's in Turkey. Turkey was involved in this as well. The Second World Congress of the Tatars, right? This meeting brought about 200 Tatar NGOs and associations from all over the world. It was attended by the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Pavlo Klimkin and Turkish Deputy Prime Minister Numan Kurtulmus. Both guys participated in the event. They had it took place. They discussed the dire conditions under, and this is quote unquote, dire conditions under which Crimean Tatars have to live in the face of encroaching Russian pressure on their cultural life. The gathering offered an opportunity for lengthy discussions about how to resolve the prolonged conflict in Ukraine and to maintain Tatars' threatened community rights under the new administration in Crimea, end quote. So Russia and the annexation of Crimea were the focus of the meeting. That they made a foolish and potentially dangerous decision. At least the decision was made between Ukraine and Turkey. It was announced by Mustafa Abdulsamil Similoglu, who was the acting leader of the Crimean Tatars, as decreed by Ukrainian President Poroshenko. They created a Muslim brigade to oppose Crimean separatism, what they call Crimean separatism, as well as human trafficking and the transportation of goods near conflict zones. In other words, they created a terrorist brigade to combat Russian involvement in Crimea and pro-Russian sentiment and activism in the area. So in other words, when they say Crimean separatism, they mean separatism from Ukraine. They mean Crimean merging with Russia. So Similoglu was a notorious CIA asset and collaborator throughout the years of the Reagan administration. He was the former leader of the Crimea Tatar Majlis. The announcement was made by Similoglu. He was received by Erdogan, who assured him of Turkey's full support for the Tatars against Russia. Turkey's been vocal about the so-called territorial integrity of Ukraine, and like the rest of NATO, has taken a pretty strong anti-Russian stance on the issue of Ukraine. But this Muslim brigade will apparently be based at Kherson, near the Crimean border, and it's going to include volunteers and jihadists from a number of other locations in the region, including what they call Tatarstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Chechnya, Georgia. Turkey's not going to be left out of the mix. It's going to be committing a number of jihadists operating within its own borders for against Syria. So you're going to ship those guys, a lot of those guys, over to the Muslim brigade to fight against Russia. In December 2013, this is important, and I got to wrap this up because there's so much more I want to get into. December 2013, Turkish intelligence sent a number of Tatar jihadists to Ukraine so they'd be able to assist the Western Color Revolution in Kiev, where terrorists, the Tatar jihadists that were sent there, acted as the quote security for the pro-European, anti-Russian protests in the Maidan, and they were suspected of being the culprits behind a number of violent acts resulting in the violent crackdown by police. It's the same type of situation that we see in so many different color revolutions where actual terror networks or proxies are used to provoke violence from the security personnel. These guys were apparently members of the Azatlik movement. That's the translated freedom movement. That was led by Nail Nabulin, the campaign for a greater Turkey. They're backed by Trotskyist parties like the Russian Left Front of Sergei Odovtsov, as well as the Turkish government. They came from Syria through Turkey, and then they went there to provoke the riot police. With that in mind, it's pretty concerning that Turkey and Ukraine are moving towards greater provocations against Russia, and as they're using jihadist terrorists on and inside Russian borders, that clearly increases the likelihood that Russia is going to be forced to engage NATO and its proxies in a direct military fashion at some point, other than in Syria. And now, of course, we see the Turkish provocations of Russia with the shooting down of the Russian jet, if that is confirmed. Now, Putin is well aware of the attempts by NATO and Turkey in particular to use terrorism against Russia inside the Russian borders. He stated when he was in Crimea recently, quote, "It's obvious that a risk remains from outside forces to destabilize the situation on the Crimean Peninsula one way or another. In certain capitals, they talk openly about the need to carry out subversive activities. Personnel are being recruited and trained to carry out subversion, acts of sabotage, to conduct radical propaganda," end quote. So, Turkey also, there's people like Webster Tarpley who have suggested that the Turkish bombing of ISIS has really been a push, or an attempt to push the ISIS forces east toward Iran and then eventually into Russia. And that's actually being somewhat supported there in terms of the evidence. So the U.S. and NATO allies basically are trying to create chaos with the new Russian territory of Crimea. That's pretty clear there. So all you have to do is look at the mainstream media like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, propaganda outlets that are now allowed to be turned domestically toward Americans, where we see this issue cropping up. We had some more quotes from Putin. I'm trying to find them. Putin has suggested that foreign countries are funding quote-unquote rights activists in an effort to, quote, destabilize the situation by playing up problems faced by Crimean Tatars. The Tatars are actually the third largest ethnic group after Russians and Ukrainians on the peninsula. Putin says, quote, "You and I know full well who we are talking about. There are a number of people who consider themselves professional fighters for rights. They want to receive foreign grants and acknowledgement and realize their ambitions, including political ambition." So there we have it. By now, hopefully this has shed a little light on this, this issue that's crept up in the media. The use of Uyghur terrorists should be obvious in both in terms of goal and methodology. We've got NATO, Turkish terror networks spanning from the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. The game plan's clear. It's destabilize and destroy any government that resists the plans of the world oligarchy and any nation that might represent a potential resistance to its plans. So there's the political wings of destabilization organizations promoting color revolutions and political subterfuge. Then we also have actual terrorist outfits conducting bombings and murders and attacks and beheadings. Clearly, NATO and Turkey in particular have committed themselves to a war on the people of the world and have subjected victim nations to these horrific living standards and unspeakable acts of violence. And at the same time, clamping down further and further on what is left of the rights of their domestic population. So the Western NATO GCC Israeli-backed social division and destabilization and warfare is now reaching a fever pitch, as we can see in Syria. And it appears the race to achieve hegemony has really begun in earnest, and so has a growing opportunity, an opposition to it. So if you're interested in looking up more about the Uyghur situation, just go see my article From Syria to Asia to Russia, Terror Network Organized by NATO and Turkey. Now, we want to move on a little bit, a little more on Putin. Around the United Nations meeting, the UN summit that occurred recently, early October, we have all this incessant propaganda being leveled at Russia and Putin himself. Clearly, the Russian bombing of ISIS in Syria has been a public relations defeat for Obama. And whatever side you want to take, it was clear that Putin's speech outshined Obama on every front at the UN summit and left the U.S. with a black eye on the reputation and credibility of the country that we could have been the envy of the world, but now we are seen basically as a petulant, albeit very dangerous child. And there was a number of things that were mentioned in the Putin speech, which we're actually not going to go into. But I've got an article. Putin calls out U.S. at UN summit. Do you realize now what you have done? That's up at BrandonTurbeville.com. And if you want to read the full speech of Vladimir Putin at the UN summit, you can feel free to do so. There is, of course, some the mainstream media has been promoting these snippets, but they're really they've misrepresented them quite a bit. Now, it's a pretty good speech. Aside from, of course, Putin keeps repeating this nonsense regarding carbon emissions and World Trade Organization rules. Well, yeah, obviously we're opposed to those things. But if you're interested in reading the speech just for interest, you can go to that article, and the entire speech there is transcribed in English, and you can read it in full, so you don't have to take the word of Chris Matthews or Wolf Blitzer or Bill O'Reilly to see what Putin said. So there's that. Soros, of course, his hand is back in the jar of Syria. Maybe we'll move on briefly and talk about something a little more important than Soros right now. Put out an article called 6 Reasons Why Russia Cares So Much About Syria, and I think a lot of people and their obsessions have become a little distracted here in terms of the ability to be able to determine what good information is and what's not. Of course, the listeners here to this show will be more knowledgeable about what's happening between Russia, Syria, and the United States than most, but what I will say is the United States is clearly at fault here. NATO is clearly at fault here, but and Russia is clearly in the defensive situation. But that does not mean that we should simply join the Putin cult, right? This is nothing against Russia. For God's sake, we've been supporting the Russian response to these situations for quite a while. If whatever happens, we cannot lose sight of the fact that it's NATO that started it, right? NATO pushed the Russians into doing whatever they're doing right now. It pushed the Russians to take Crimea. It pushed the Russians to get involved in Ukraine. It pushed the Russians to get involved in Syria. Anything that happens that affects us negatively at this point is the fault of NATO. It's the fault of aggressive policies. So we can't lose sight of that. But it's also important not to just simply join a cult, a personality, and say, oh, well, NATO's bad, so Russia must be the second coming of Christ. It's not. Why is Russia involved in Syria? Well, it's involved in Syria because it has interests in Syria. Think about this. Vladimir Putin is not sitting in the Kremlin on the internet watching videos of Syria and saying, oh my God, we have to help these poor people. Let us commit troops and treasure to Syria to help them because what great humanitarians we are. That is not what he's doing. If it was what he was doing, then he would have committed troops and treasure to Libya when the situation was happening there. But the interests of Russia and Libya were not firm, and that was part of Gaddafi's mistake. That they didn't court Russia as much as he should have, and so that's why there was no Russian involvement. There wasn't even a veto. There wasn't even a veto in by Russia. So keep that in mind. So it's the mainstream media, of course, is going to present Russia's moves basically as aggression, that it wants world domination, as the establishment of the Fourth Reich. For the alternative media, you're going to see the Russian move being somewhat more sophisticated, but still lacking. For instance, that's kind of divided in the alternative media. Some of them simply see the Russian involvement on the basis of not wanting to see any further escalation. They oppose the Russian involvement for that reason. They don't want to see further escalation. I'm sorry, that I think is short-sighted and sort of dumb. Others just heap lavish praise upon Putin for his decisions and present the Russian president as the potential leader for the world. And that's a dangerous zone there. I think that is the cult of personality that people tend to want to fall into. They want someone that they can believe in. And for them, obviously, the Barack Obama, that the fool in our capital, is not... is not someone they can believe in, the hope pope, but for them, Putin represents the opposition, so they can believe in him. And unfortunately, people who do that fall for cults and leaders left and right. Now, the geopolitical back and forth that's been taking place between Russia and the West, again, I want to make it clear, the Russians have acted entirely in self-defense. This has been entirely the West that's provoked the current tensions. But in the context of Syria, Iran, and Ukraine, Russia has clearly stood on the right side of history. The United States and NATO have clearly moved further and further in the opposite direction. But Russia, as I said, it's been a savior in Syria. It's been a savior in Iran. It's been a savior in Ukraine. But Russian foreign policy is not a charity case. Putin is concerned with the fate of Russia, and you can't blame him for that. Actually, that in terms of being a national leader, that should actually make you respect him more, right? That he's interested not in policing the world and committing troops and treasure across the world to defend these different things. He's interested, it's Russia for Russia, or in other words, Russia first. It'd be nice if we had that kind of outlook here. So, whatever you want Putin to do in Syria is going to be subject to geopolitical, national, and domestic interests of Russia and the Russian people, and that's fine. I think that's fine, and we have a situation right now where the Russian interests align with the right side of history. So what are the Russian interests? Basically, in short, it's the pipeline. Here, I'm going to list 6 of them. Pipeline, well, there's maybe 7. Let's look at the pipeline. The West has long desired a Qatari pipeline project that would come from the oil fields of Qatar and come through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, into Syria, then into Turkey, and then it would have gone to Europe. That, besides the obvious benefits for Qatar and the basic addition of another source of oil and gas for Europe, the pipeline would represent a substantial reduction in the amount of leverage Russia currently holds over Europe. As of today, Russia is the main provider of the majority of Europe's oil and gas. If the EU decides to act too provocative in its eastern regions, like Ukraine or other areas of the Russian sphere of influence, Russia has the trump card of being able to turn off the oil and gas spigot, and that would get very cold very fast in Europe. So Europe would have only a few options in the short and medium term other than to come around to Russia's way of thinking. The development of the Qatari pipeline, that trump card that Russia has over Europe would simply be removed, right? Because if the Russians cut off the spigot, then the Qataris could simply cut on the spigot or open it further, and then nobody would have to really pay attention to what Russia had to say, because the oil and gas would be coming from Qatar. The Europeans would be warm and cozy as the Russians lost all that money. So they would be, again, that the oil and gas related income is related to this too. Now, in 2009, Assad nixed the Qatari pipeline and said he was going to work with Iran and Iraq. There's a pipeline that would have come through from Iran into Iraq, into Syria, and then on to Europe. that's not directly beneficial to Russia's oil company, since Gazprom wouldn't be in control of that. But it would have presented a situation in which that oil that was going to Europe anyway goes to Europe and is provided by an ally. Iran, Iraq, Syria, particularly Iran and Syria. These are allies. They're not likely to join the NATO sphere of influence anytime soon, especially not now. Now, quickly, the warm water port. Russia, in its history, has long needed a warm water port. We've got, there's a number of those now: Sevastopol, Crimea, Tartus. The Syrian port of Tartus has been a major force behind Russian support of Assad and Syria throughout the crisis. The Russians only controlled a portion of the Tartus port up to this recent time. It seems that in concert with the Russian military involvement, Russia now controls virtually the entire port. So one has to wonder whether or not this was part of the deal. Yes, we'll come in and assist you if we get the port, period. That's something that had been sort of resisted by the previous Assad government, the father, and even this Bashar. But recently, however, it's been allowed, and I think that's a good deal to make. It's a port, but it's better than losing your whole country. So it certainly sweetened the deal. It's a new development, and again, as I said, it's caused a lot of people to wonder whether or not Russia was able to squeeze greater control of the Tartus port out of Assad at a critical moment. But again, I think that was a good decision by Assad to just sort of make that conciliation. We're not going to get to all of these, but I want to say strategic influence. That's another one. The domino theory. Russia sees NATO and the GCC creeping up to its borders. It is being surrounded by NATO. It's trying not to see that happen. Russia does not want to be surrounded and then destroyed, so it's trying to prevent this creeping march by the NATO powers. He wants to fight terrorism abroad, but so they don't have to fight it in Russia. They don't want to be fighting suicide bombings in Russian cities. They want to make sure that that's away from Russia. They're also worried about Turkish expansion, the Neo-Ottoman Empire, and what I mean by that is what we've discussed earlier, the push by Erdogan to push terrorists into Russia, then take these areas that belong to Russia and provide them safety under the Ottoman Empire. So that's a lot of reasons that Russia's interested in that. We'll carry more on about that next week. I always run out of time when I get to these topics, but we'll try to catch up with that next week. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.